And it's a delight for me, to be honest, to be able to focus on this book that was published way back in 2001. And to say it's versions of Rilke's poems in French is almost an exaggeration. Sometimes it's arguments with Rilke. Sometimes his poems say one thing and I can't take it. I just say, no, it's not like that, it's like this. So sometimes it's a fight with him. And I think of it very much as a reader's book. You know, the way when you get very absorbed with an author, they move into your house and you have these little mental discussions with them in the bath, and sometimes they become more real to you than the people that actually live there. Does anyone know that experience? It's very, you know, it can be very possessing, and that happened with these poems. So it's a kind of mirror of those discussions. Sometimes it's angry, sometimes not. But the other thing to say about it is the unexpectedness that Rilke should write nearly 500 poems in French. And I think he wrote in Russian too. We might talk a little bit about what that was about when we have a chat. It was the unexpectedness of that, and also the kind of, that they're not at the centre of his extraordinary oeuvre, they're kind of over here, which made me feel freer perhaps to play with them than I could have done with those great German language poems. So that, I bumped into them in this edition, which is American. I've picked this up in America, where I think in the kind of new wave of interest in Rilke from the 60s and 70s, they were kind of ahead of us. And it's by a writer called A. Poulin Jr., and it's a dual language edition, and you can probably see my scrawlings all over them there. So it's the French and then his quite close, careful versions of Rilke on the other side. And the other thing to say is Rilke's French poems feel very different. So again, I think I felt a bit of a license to play. I didn't ever intend it to be a book. So it was something I did that I think many poets do, is you have something at the side to scribble at when poems aren't necessarily coming, that feels related to the activity of poetry but is not exactly it. So that was how it began. And the place I wrote them, it was when I was living in the Welsh Hills. So they're very associated for me with pastoral. And I'm a bit of an urban person, so that was a kind of shock to the system, and went with these poems and where I was when I was writing them. And the first group, I picked the book up in about 1991, so the whole process took place in the 90s. Never intended to be a book, but I published them bit by bit during the 90s in other books, and the whole collection then came out in 2001. The first ones were a group called The Windows. And Rilke's originals are very mannered in a way. So he will say things like, "Oh, windows." And it was very difficult for me to think of a way to put that into contemporary English, or even to imagine the voice that might say, "Oh, windows, you are like this." So there's often a woman framed in the windows as well. So it's very claustrophobic. It's a room with windows and a woman. So in order to try and, in my head, to make this into something that made sense to me, I sort of thought, who would be talking to windows? Who would be talking to furniture, which also sometimes happens? It's a drunk guy in a hotel room. So my Rilke for this is a kind of cross between himself and Philip Marlowe the detective, or someone like that. He often appears drunk in the poems. So it's that kind of voicing that gave me a little way in when I started to play with poems. So I'll start by reading some of these Windows poems, which were actually a response to some sketches by his then girlfriend, Merline, who was an artist. She sketched windows, and he together they published a book with his poems and her sketches. So it's a sort of love project for him, I think, as well. I've given them titles, he gave them numbers. I've numbered them with times of day, because it just seemed to give that kind of claustrophobic, I'm in a hotel room all the time feeling. So I'll read a few of these and then we'll have a chat. 10 a.m. It's enough that all the things around are more real than anything else, more real than me. The furniture, balcony, doors, the windows, I spoke to them and they talked back. Then a woman, shy, came into the picture and the windows flattened back into the walls. The furniture sat down again on the carpet. Her arms, hair, smell made the dead things quiet again. I knew I would lose her too. 11 p.m. I won't stop talking to you just because you're acting strange. You mouthed off all day yesterday, blinds flapping in the breeze, and now not a peep out of you, and the thin curtain only just moving. I'm waiting, listening, could wait all day. It doesn't diminish me to look a fool with my cheek against your glass for hours. I've got time and a triumphant soul, because you'll crack eventually and let me through or let me in. New. Talking to you like this makes everything clear. The lines that shape the world glow so I understand them. A woman may be beautiful, but I can tolerate even that when you put yourself between us, making us look. No chance that who I am can get lost in this space, small, airy, like love, with me in the middle. "2 p.m. It's true, I do talk to you more when I'm drunk. The chair pulled up close, my forehead and the glass in my hand pressed against the pane. My nose is so close up, I can see the separate pores reflected on your surface. So there's me, or my face at least, but all the time the shadow of something else, the dirt on the glass, the big mess outside. 3 a.m. I'm starting to count you now, as though you might hide with the others around the room if once I lost track of the numbers. Did I sit on the sill, or was it someone I knew, spending hours there, so it seemed, trying to touch the one I didn't love with meaning? I'm drunk again, you know, so drunk it all gets clearer for a second until I glimpse my reflection, bent double, falling down, blind. 4 a.m. I do want love deep down, somewhere in the back of my spine. I watch the window now as if she were a woman, stretching the stars into dawn, everything a lover must know. She's mean early on, but I like that. It gets me ready for the sun's explosion, when my eyes don't know what to do with all that after the different abandon of the night. Maybe there's nothing there after all but the air, but I'm sure the sky must be made of more, the way the birds seem to hold onto it, the way they move their feathers, the way they measure it, taste it, fuck it as they fly. 6 a.m. Oh, boo-hoo, oh shame. Window, your skin's wet inside from my tears and wet outside with rain. We've come this close, too late, too soon. Now I'm dressed up in curtains, voile, organdy, void. 8 p.m. I can't help it. I taste whatever you have to offer. You taste of night and day. You taste of all the weathers. Maybe that's everything. Maybe nothing. All show for the eyes, keeping me awake in case I miss something wonderful. Promises, promises. And all the while the world shrivels in front of me. I'm tired and still my eyes gobble roses, rainforests, oceans, satellites, the moon. "11 a.m. I'm a sod in the morning, and so are you, sky, up there all square, mouthing things at me and licking the room till it's worn out, until it sticks its tongue out at you in return. Two great liars wagging their tongues at each other, then at me. And watch what you say about me, or I'll beat you up. I'll beat all the bad tongues. You say it again and again. You keep talking about the fall, the rug, the dirty drop into bed. Midnight. I'm just playing around, window, fooling my own eyes and you, when I want so much to translate us both into the sky. You've pulled out of me a final form which comes through you or from you. There's a crack in the corner where the putty is loose. I want to climb and see you climb too into a new constellation. You, window, and you, stars, and me. I want us all to be rhymes. That's that bit.
Thank you very much. I was very struck by what you said about Rilke kind of possessing you and possessing your house and chatting with him in the bar. Very difficult to imagine Rilke in the bar. He was so august. But I'm wondering, you talk about in the introduction about how it was a kind of affinity with Rilke, and I'm just wondering why Rilke. I mean, I'm quite intrigued that so many contemporary poets, are called somehow by Rilke. And I wonder if you kind of know what it was that was there and was worrying at you.
Well, I don't really know the answer to that. It's just a book. I picked it up in a bookshop in America because, certainly at that time, the same books weren't available in both places. There wasn't really Amazon or anything like that. So I was browsing. I saw that. It was the oddity of him writing in French, because I knew a little bit the great German poems and was very kind of overawed by them. But the kind of oddness of writing in another language, and then I just bought it to read, and then gradually they grabbed me because they're strange, they're frothy, they're not quite like the larger German Rilke. The French also, I've only got schoolgirl French, I should sort of confess that straight up. The French isn't that difficult.
It's always a help.
Yes, it's always a help. So there's that too. But also, while I enjoyed them, I found I didn't agree with them. And in a way, the windows, the bit I've just read, is the bit that's closest to the original, despite the odd voicing and the drunkenness. But after that, I kind of developed this notion that I wanted to talk to him. In some of the later ones that I'll read, he appears as a character in the poems. So they're very much not translations. You can put poems side by side, but sometimes they're disagreements, or kind of one riffs off the other.
And sometimes you start as a translation and then move into something else, something of your own, in a sense.
Yeah, and I think one of the clues to that, for me, is it very much in the voicing. And in fact, for all of the whole book, really, who is speaking. And I've translated a little bit since this, together with language specialists for living poets, particularly living poets in the Middle East who would not be otherwise translated into English. And there's much more of a kind of importance of keeping their voice and what they want to say very clear and bringing that into English. And for this I didn't feel that at all. I probably should, but in fact no, because this book is a very good job at that already. But this was a very different kind of project in which I could just talk, argue, develop something else.
The voice is I'm really glad you brought that up, because I was reading this sort of on my way here, just the whole book just sort of through like that, and one of the things that really struck me was a kind of very particular voice, which isn't the same always, and yet it picks up images and tones, across the book. And I'm wondering, I suppose I'm interested in, creating, of course you use lots of voices in your other work as well, and I'm interested in, did creating this voice, this particular voice you talked about, the drunk in the hotel room, did it allow you to say things that you couldn't say in your own voice, or what, is it a kind of escape or a sort of ventriloquism? Or?
All of those, I think all of those things are probably true, yes, but also there is enough of an element of translation in them to feel you're actually stepping into someone's shoes, which I think for a poet is always really good. You get outside this head and body and become something else, and find new things that surprise you. And I was very surprised by an awful lot of that, yeah. And there's also, we'll get onto this a little bit more with a sequence called The Roses, but there's also a sense, I was a younger poet, a younger female poet, trying to find my way, and there's also a sense of engaging with, a big male character in the canon. And how do you do that? What do you do? What do you take in? What do you subvert? How do you possess it?
Of course, Auden did describe Rilke as one of the greatest lesbian poets.
Like that, very nicely put. Yes, and maybe that allows for it as well. Yes. Yes.
We'll come back to lesbian poets in a minute, but should we hear a second set?
Okay, let's do that. So, among his French poems, there's a whole set that he wrote in the Valais area of Switzerland, which are literally pastoral, because he's in the area where, shepherds go up and down the mountain. And they're very interesting poems, because he addresses the landscape, but it's a short step from the landscape to the great unknown, so it's like hill, and then, what's out there? It's a very quick movement from there, from the physical to the metaphysical, which is not really in me. However, the good thing about him engaging with the pastoral in that way was that I did write these in the Welsh Hills. So I've transported them into my own territory, and I've used the place names around where I lived as the titles for these poems. And it's as if Rilke comes into my countryside rather than the other way round, and he does appear as a kind of guest actor in the poems. And so all the titles are place names. And there's also a kind of, I lived on the borders, so there's a kind of Welsh language, English language vibe going on. Mary in her introduction referenced the Forest of Dean, which is actually very close to where these were written on the Welsh-English border too. So the village where I lived is called Gladestree, and I've called these the Gladestree quatrains. Gwaith Brook. I'm always cladding myself in what's just undressed me. My body's a laugh, every cell a round, rude wavelet. So I change my outfit, even my long hair, my skin. Behind this kind of flight, my life ripples, totally see-through. Hunter Hill. Tiny rows of light, a wall crumbling in on itself. The slopes of the hill, or of my cheek, hesitate, while the excess of light stamps its feet in the lane, all over me, insisting on the wrong route. Gwaithla Road. It's absent-minded, full of sheep and mud, this lane, and beautiful light goldsmiths would want to set into stone. The rowan, in its exact place, opposes a vertical against the slow, robust field, which stretches itself and yawns. Kevenir. Do you see up there those high pastures of angels among the heather? In the strange light, they seem more than far. Down the clear valley and right up to the ridge, you can see yourself break into fragments which float in the air. Bird, mite, balloon, bat, RAF, hawk. Glascoon. This slope has wings, as do our bats, and the dragonflies, and every bird, flaunting as if resting on updrafts could make a creature invisible. Look, the light doesn't lie heavy on us at all. We can move our legs and arms through the honey, and even the grass wears its worms with grace. Old Radnor. Mauve rose in the high grass, hedges in straight lines, the sky looking down scornfully and at me. I'm sad in that incomer way, ardent and small. I don't understand why the same past is different for us, why I remember and the sky forgets. Katie Tryler. Before you can count to 10, everything changes. The wind flicks clarity out of even the high thistle stalks and flings it in my face, so close it can't be seen. A precipice on a border mountain gives more certain footing than this spot, where long grass displaces itself overnight, in wind, in rain, lies down under the clear air, as if stroked by the hand which made it up. And Rilke's a guest in this poem, from Glade Street to Museau, which was where he was writing. I'm in a lane that turns and plays across the escarpment, like a ribbon you might knot around a summer hat. You're in a Museau vineyard, hat on head, as if you'd invented wine. And what wine? A comet promised for next year. Rilke spotted above Gilwern. Honeysuckle launches out of a hedge tangled with bindweed, flowers alert, tongues hanging out for the moment to close. You're walking up the lane towards me with a bouquet of red berries from the hedgerow. Already? Is summer over? Another step closer, and you will have autumn for a lover. Road not available. You know how a man speaking about his mother suddenly looks like her, mid-sentence, right there. The fields above the stream often take to gurning their parents like that, endless remembering in which they drink their pasts further and further down, while the hill looks over its shoulder and seems to start back into pure space, returning, like the pasture, to the astonishment of its origin. That's enough of them.
Well, origin, there's a
Word
finish
on
on.
origin, exactly.
Auden talked about
He
how...
actually said the best lesbian poets in Sappho when he was called.
But he also learnt a lot from Rilke and talked about how particularly it was, he saw in Rilke a way to understand human life in terms of landscape. That's what he learned, he said, from Rilke.
That's really interesting.
And I mean, do you think that's what your poems are doing, or is it's almost the other way around actually? Understanding landscape in terms of human life.
It is that kind of reversal, but what my debt to Rilke here is that I was living in this countryside, but coming from the city, and I'd lived there already for 10 years. I'd never found a way to write about it. So this became the vehicle to actually respond to what was around me very, very strongly.
Though that's very interesting, isn't it? To get to know your own territory through a kind of very different territory. I mean,
which is maybe why I made him walk in. He's like the kind of mediator for me and my surroundings in these. And
yet, actually, I mean, you read one of the poems where you talk about yourself, or you talk about the lyric subject in the poems as a kind of outsider, a borderer. It's a very, I mean, one of the things perhaps it's worth saying is that when Rilke ended up in Switzerland for the last few years of his life and wrote all these poems, it was the first home he'd ever had. He was a sort of archetype of the itinerant poet, sponging off women, throughout Europe. And then finally, this was his first home. And it's so interesting that your poems that reflect on this are all about, it seemed to me, unsettledness and unhomeliness.
That's true, and I think the border lends itself to that. Borders are fascinating. Well, as you know, borders just are rich. They're really, really interesting, and the border people are also rich and fascinating in that there'll be one thing at one moment to another, whatever, they move, they glide between beautifully. So there's a sense of the liminal place, but also an old place. It is, where I was living, it was tribal before it was Welsh or English. So it was the kingdom of Elvel, and it would have had a dialect or probably a kind of old Celtic or Pictish speech, which was not Welsh or English as we know it. So there's a sense that you're tapping into something very old and predating current geographies even. So it's just it's just a fascinating place to be. It kind of doesn't let you live there. It lets you sort of borrow it for a bit and then, respond to it. But,
I was also very, it's interesting that you talked about that going back to a kind of ancient way of being in the landscape, because I was very struck that in a way, sort of having done all the big German poems that were all about, sort of moving from the landscape to the angels, to the metaphysical realm. In a way, in the French poems, Rilke comes back, really, he discovers the landscape in a way. And yet, in your landscapes, there's always this kind of harking back to origins, to a kind of endless remembering. And so a kind of landscape turns into almost a kind of timescape as well. It's a sort of...
Timescape is good and interesting because also where I was living was not far from this equally ancient place where my parents came from, the Forest of Dean, with its own dialect again, even now. So for me it was remembering and connecting to that, but also being cut off from it because I don't belong there. There's a kind of sense of not belonging in that way, through time as well as place.
Well, it's so great to have a sort of a place with two languages, to be a response to Switzerland where German and French were spoken, and Rilke was fluent. I went there to visit Mozart actually.
Did you?
To do a radio program about it, and I kind of thought that Rilke probably didn't know much French really, that he had his sort of gang around him and talked German, but he talked French all the time and was thought of as basically French, a French poet. But I find that very interesting that you've chosen a kind of bilingual place to reflect the tensions and strangenesses of Switzerland.
Well, a lot about this book was kind of happenstance and luck. It was luck that I was living there, and luck that this book fell into my hand at that time. And I wrote these poems early in the morning, looking over a field. So there's a sense I really was writing them in the landscape. It was one summer. I just got up at 6 and went into the landscape, looking at it, and wrote them.
Shall we have some?
Let's get on to the sex, shall we?
Waited long enough.
Yes. Okay. So, and maybe this could be probably the last group. Anyway, we'll see how we go. We'll see how we go. Okay, so one of the other groups of poems in French was a group called the Roses, and Rilke wrote in his German language poems, the rose is a very important symbol as well, and it's the symbol of femininity in all its kind of glorious ways. In these poems in French, his French is quite economic anyway, but I'd been working with these for a while, but what struck me was the incredible economy of his images. I've had to bring in a lot more images than he used, so it's sort of petal, space, petal. I began to realise that actually he was probably speaking about female genitalia, and that these poems were about more than one woman in that sense. By then it was too late, I was too far in the project to stop. So my poems have kind of turned that round a bit. They're still quite sexy, but he addresses the roses, and he says, "Oh rose, you are like this. Oh rose, you are outside the door, you're a bit sad. Oh rose, you are this." And I've turned them round, so in mine the roses speak. They have the voice, so there's a kind of power shift. And his are not titled, and mine are titled. Each one is titled with the name of a rose in Botanical Latin. And I had lots of fun, getting books about roses and matching them up with poems and how that might work. So although this is perhaps the most argumentative of all the sequences for me, but it's also a kind of extended love poem to Rilke himself at the same time. So here we go. Rosa Gallica. If sometimes you're surprised by my coolness, it's because inside myself, petal against petal, I'm asleep. I've been completely awake while my heart dozed for who knows how long, speaking aphids and bees to you in silence, speaking English through a French mouth. Rosa Hemispherica. You see me as half open, a book whose pages can be turned by the wind, then read with your eyes closed. Butterflies stream out, stunned to discover they think just like you. Dab wings all over your face. Rosa Fetida. I'm an imperfect thing, neat, layered, but spilling petals and pollen, dropping bruised scent onto the ground. Essence of roses is not sweet, but brown at the edges, like the air you breathe. Rosa centifolia. So you think you caused the bud to bloom, enchanted the petals into smiling. We're talking Rosa centifolia, the 100-petaled rose. Ask the bee, who can't concentrate on anything else. Rosa nitida. Space folds against space. Petal touches petal. You look at me as though you want to fall in, make the flower glow with your own image, change my meaning from rose to narcissus. Rosa pimplefolia. Oh, I'm leaning against your forehead, against your eyelid, scenting your skin with my own, making you think you can sleep inside my face. Rosa sancta. Now you've made a saint out of me, Saint Rose, open-handed, she who smells of God naked. But for myself, I've learned to love the whiff of mildew, because though not Eve exactly, yes, I stink of the fall. Rosa Damascena. You're inclined to confuse me with yourself, as if you'd found a mirror to worship. I'm guilty too, breathing you in to catch a trace of twice-blooming damask. Rosa canina. Look, I'm growing out of your left eye, snagging your retina with little thorns, rooting behind your frontal lobes. What can you see through the 100 pink tongues? Now you've a pupil who speaks perfume, attracts bees. Rosa foliosa. You touch me with everything that's touched you. Pages and pages of past butterflies stroke me, moaning like the dictionary under the weight of it all, and I tremble, stupid, hybrid, perpetual, as I let you read me better. Does everyone know what thrips are? Any gardeners? Thrips are a tiny little insect that eats petals, but it's one of my favourite words because it's the same in singular as in plural. So you get one thrips and lots of thrips. So your task is all to get this word in a poem of your own. Rosa pteracantha. Spinning in the wind so fast, even the thrips, my little petal-scarring insects, fly off dizzy. So fast you can't touch me without risking a thorn, can only watch as my heart is shaken out into the world. Rosa mundi. Oh God, here I stand, feet in my own grave, smiling, lifting your face in my own hands. I turn you to the sun and hold you there, waiting to see what will open in the light.
Thank you. You talked about an extended love poem, and it's kind of interesting because it's so sexual in a sense, isn't it? And Rilke was the most asexual person imaginable, who had, of course, a lot of very rich patronesses. But even the close lover Balladina at the end, he addressed her in the formal Z form right to the end, even though she asked to be called you in the intimate form, but he was having none of it. So there's a certain sort of and I'm interested that you respond so that the poems respond so passionately to a kind of standoffishness which is there in the Rose poems, actually.
It may be part of the argument because he does. It's like Rilke's geranium outside the door. Sometimes these roses feel as they are pushed out and they're outside the door and they're defined and explained. So in a way, it was the one that got me most annoyed because it was placing women like this. So in my turning of that round, I guess something very sensual appeared. Though I do think his space and petal are, I don't think I'm wrong that they do stand for female genitalia. Once you're in that territory, you've got to go there.
But also they're so transcendental, and you read the one with the whiff of mildew, and the few sort of scents and brown edges and things, and you get the feeling that this is a very kind of earthly response to a poetry which is always kind of pushing for the...
I think it's a refusal. It's a refusal to be on a pedestal or to be to become ethereal. It's to do with senses and the earthy.
Oh, and that one at the end that has the roots in the roots in the earth. I suppose the other thing that kind of struck me very forcibly when you were reading those, and also the ones you chose there, was that they were being read, the roses, and earlier we had in that poem Midnight we had a kind of translation into sky as well. So how much, when you were translating and thinking about Rilke and responding, were you also kind of working on a sense of an aesthetic project for yourself?
I think the project grew. It certainly wasn't a project at the beginning. It was me playing. It was a game, a playful thing. And I think, as I said, I never intended these to be published at the beginning at all. I didn't think it was like that. It was something to do that was textured and wordy and really interesting. But then, as the pages accumulated, I suppose it changed. It changed as it grew on, and I've done them kind of in chronological order. So the roses come towards the end of the four groupings, And the last lot aren't really a grouping, they're just ones that of the rest, that I sort of thought I could play with.
Can I ask you about the Rosamundi, where you said in a kind of throwaway line, "Oh God," and I can't remember the rest of the line now, but I was just struck by that, just hearing it like that as well. Because of course Rilke, there are tomes written about whether Rilke was religious in any kind of conventional sense or not, and I've noticed you pretty much bracketed out that, except in the last section, which I hope you might read a couple of poems from, where the angel appears and oh God. Was the religious Rilke in these years something that you were also arguing with or grappling with in some way?
I don't know about arguing with that. I think for me, I just get the sense of this big other that I can't define in Rilke as God or not God. There's a big other, isn't there? That's where you go when you look at the hill. Then you go there. But oh God is a nice phrase because it's both, referencing what we might think of as God, but just as an interjection too. And the point about Rosamundi and the roots and the feet in the own grave is it also references a poem by George Herbert in which a flower has its roots in the grave. So I was bringing it back to another poetry there. I couldn't help it, it was the same image. So.
Will you give us another couple for the end, do you think?
Yeah,
and then we can perhaps have some general questions and also then open it up for discussion as well.
Okay. So this is this last section is just stuff. So Rilke appears as a guest again. So I'll read this one because we sit down to dinner, which would be quite exciting. Dinner with Rilke. Stay stock still if suddenly the angel at your table decides to love you. Pretend not to look by smoothing out wrinkles in the cloth under the bread and ham. Offer him your own food casually to taste in turn, so you can watch beauty as he puts an everyday glass to his lips. You can't help yourself, though he's avid for everything, eating, kissing, anything to become you, to repossess your house. This one I want to read because it's my only poem which has wind in it, gut wind. Song. Which of the organs inside vibrates when angels sing? Somewhere between my kidneys and small intestine, a voice, tender and intrepid, is humming tonight. A bubble of wind, memory, all my invisible mortality. And the other feature of the book is that the 4 sections are divided by poems called lies. So there are 5 lies, one at the start and then one at the end. And again, taken from a couple of poems by Rilke that I split up, rearranged, changed, and in a way they undercut. I like them because they undercut what they precede and what they follow, so nothing is very grounded in the book. I'll read you a couple of the lies. The first lie. I'm the little toy you'll shatter, the garden with miraculous hiding places. You dart in and out just to be half found. I'm the wind that sings in braille, your own shadow getting longer, the beautiful holes that whimper in your brain. The third lie. I haven't explained myself. You close your eyes, you leap. It's almost a devout thing to do, or so God says, or another trap. Opening your eyes later, you get remorse, like a joke. Stood next to such a gorgeous lie, you're in danger of looking fake. One more lie. The fourth lie. You say, I dreamt, and not, I lied. When you wake up, it's a strange bed. You open the door, shamefaced, on a room so devastated you run for the lift to the ground floor. It tings, says, doors closing. There are lies flying in the air, utterly grey from living upside down.
Thank you. I was very struck in that, I didn't know you were going to read those, and I was very struck in that last one about the ting, the doors closing. Do you feel that, at the end of this project, you're kind of done with Rilke, actually? I mean, had you got out of him what you needed or wanted, or, is there a sort of sense of an ongoing thing which you might come back to?
I don't know. I don't think I will come back to it. I can't imagine myself treating, as I said before, treating the German language poems in quite the same way, although maybe somebody should. And I think for me it was of its place and of its time. So I think that probably is the end of that. It doesn't mean I won't read him and be fascinated, but as a writing project, not.
Yeah.
But although, having said that, I would love another project like this, but I think it's not something you can go to the library and kind of find. In a way, it has to find you, just like this book found its way into my hand and then gradually worked its way into my brain. So I'm waiting. I've got the space in my head for something else like that.
Can I ask about form as well, actually, which we haven't spoken about? Rilke's French poems are notable for their, in a sense, simplicity, as opposed to the German ones. And yet, when I've had a go at translating some of them, sometimes it's almost like they disappear under your pen as you're trying to do it. You begin to think, oh, maybe they're just about sound, actually. And I wondered, you don't rhyme them in the way that Rilke does, and that was obviously a choice. Where was the kind of tension with the form? What did you find?
What I took from him was the quatrains generally. So generally they pretty much follow his shape, although sometimes I've built more than one poem into some quatrains of my own inventing. And he does lots of full rhyme, and I don't do that. Sometimes there's small rhymes that are not full. But I very much tried to find a music that was as intense as his. I don't think I succeeded, but music and what it felt like to the ear was very important.
Yes. Do you think, I have the impression sometimes that poets that translate Rilke, German or the French, actually it inflects their own language in a sense. And Don Patterson's got a very good image of that. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow, about how it kind of creates a channel in your head as sort of like a waterway, and creates sort of links and pathways. And then when you finish translating, actually those pathways remain, and it allows you to say things that you never could have said before, kind of stretches your language. Do you, I was scouring your recent work to have a look to see if I could see anything Rilkean, and I'm not sure actually. I wonder, do you think there's a kind of more, are there those pathways, do you think, in your poetry now because of this project?
Possibly the musical ones. It wouldn't surprise me, but I think more a kind of metaphysical opening or daring, in that, now, perhaps before I wouldn't have felt I could go from mountain to the yawning other, and perhaps now I might.
Well, that is just a brilliant place to pause, and there's a first question already, and I'm sure there are more. So perhaps we could open it to...
I've been thinking for a long time that there were poems enough Mutability that draw on Jo's Rilke poems like My Oak. I don't think she could have written those poems without what she did, what we heard her saying with Rilke.
Yeah.
And also set in the same landscape.
Yes, absolutely. And there's more than My Oak. There's about half a dozen poems in that book that play with the landscape in that part of Wales, England.
It's not just the landscape, it's the mode of thought. there's a certain abstraction, even though he doesn't deal with abstract words. It's an abstraction thought to Rilke, and that sort of thought is more present in Alpha Mutability than in her book, for instance.
Yeah.
And it kind of bringing the landscape and the things in the landscape alive and giving them a human kind of ability to be.
Yeah.
I
I have amazing readers here.
think that's right. That one of the things that English language poetry doesn't quite dare is to take sometimes contemporary is to take those big words like soul. And for Rilke, they were very comfortable. It was a very comfortable sort of abstract area. I mean, he wasn't always abstract. It kind of collapsed into the figurative as well, and it's a constant to and fro. But perhaps that's one of the things he allows sort of people to come out of their kind of comfort zone, or the comfort zone of contemporary English language poetry.
And maybe to make the concrete resonate just a bit more. Perhaps it stretches, the resonation stretch a little bit further.
He uses concrete language just to describe abstract ideas.
Yes, I think that's nicely put. Yeah.
I think also his first 3 books in German mirrored the French work in simplicity, Advent and so on. Much simpler than the new poetry and Orpheus and so on, the analogies.
Yes. No, that's right. Are there any? I mean, we could carry on talking for a very long time actually, but I'm very aware that we stand between you and a glass of wine. But there may well be lots of other questions. I'm very happy to.
Did Rilke understand women?
That's a big question. Did Rilke understand
As a
women?
male, has he an extra sensitive understanding of women
Well, he was lesbian.
as a form?
Yes. Well, I can speak to the French poems, and you can perhaps do the rest. But I can't speak of the man, but I can only speak of the poems and what I see in them, because I never met him, obviously. The quarrel, I think, the quarrel in the roses is all centred around that. That's a kind of almost a dialogue without the other voice, where he's definitely placing the female figures for himself in a way that made me want to argue with him.
But in any case, is there a generic woman to be understood? I mean, if you unlock the understanding of one individual woman, does that unlock the understanding of all women?
Good point.
I don't know how to answer that.
Let's not go there.
To go somewhere quite different. Could I just ask about your feelings on, I suppose, the border between translation and then maybe a retranslation, then a version, and maybe what seems to be a very argument even.
Yeah.
Do you see it as a continuum, or do you see that there's a zone in which you're trying your best to be faithful to the original, even though that will require some elaborate things to be done, or do you see it as a kind of a fluid?
Not in these at all. No, I wasn't faithful to the original at all.
Oh no, I understand, but do you see that the act of
I think there is a continuum is a good word for it, and I think in other translation projects I've undertaken, I have felt that responsibility much more when I've worked with living poets, for example. And just recently I've worked with a language expert from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London on some poems by Pashtun poets on the borders of Afghanistan. And it was really important there to try and get what they wanted to say and the way they wanted to say it into English, which was hard. And I would say the poems that I came up with were not as skillful as these, but they gave more of the original into English for very good reasons. So I think there are different reasons for doing it differently, and a continuum is a good way of describing it. Yeah.
That's right. I think there's a different depth to a writer depending on their kind of status. Also, I mean, if you're retranslating Shakespeare or something, then you have a kind of infinite freedom because of what's gone before. But if you're translating a young writer, an unknown writer, I perhaps for the first time into English, then I do think that without
It's a responsibility.
responsibility,
Yeah,
without necessarily
definitely.
kind of calculating, you do feel a kind of urgency about really bringing them across, and perhaps even effacing yourself a little more.
Yes.
Whereas with Rilke, you know, you have a sense of all these translators before you as well.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a couple of questions about the publication life of the work.
Yeah.
Two-pronged questions really. One is, I mean, the book has been out of print for years. Has there been any attempt to get it republished anywhere?
It's just back in print now.
Is it? All right.
And it's on Kindle.
Fair enough. Okay, well that question.
Rilke
Done.
on Kindle, isn't that kind of
Uh,
contradiction in tone?
House's Molière has been retranslated back into French, and Celan's Shakespeare has been retranslated back into English. Has there been any movement towards trying to translate those into French or German?
What a great idea.
Yeah. There's a project.
No, but I like your thinking. But the whole publication history is all accidental, which is also, it's interesting because it's my favourite book, and it's probably my least known one. Always was a quiet little book, partly because the sections were published in other books as they came, so they were in my other poetry books in a little section. But then, just by the chance of, I was published by Oxford University Press, and in the 1990s it shut its poetry list, and I was out of print. So my new publisher was willing to do a selected, but not to include the Rilke sections. So I persuaded them to put them in a separate book, otherwise they never would have been. So it was entirely accidental and to do with publishing and all of that. But I'm glad, I mean, it's nice to have that.
I wanted to ask about Rilke guesting in the book. In the first selection you read, I could hear Rilke's voice, but then by the rose sequence, I very much felt it was you speaking to Rilke. So how was it when Rilke appeared in the poems as another, and what did that do to the process?
It was one of those points that, you know, I'm sure there's lots of poets here, but you'll all recognise this, which took me by surprise. I didn't know he was going to suddenly become a character
That's what I wondered.
in the poems at all. But then I think it was when I was writing one about the lane, and when you all know what this feels like, you create a space in a poem, and then you actually want something to come into it or happen. And what else could happen? But Rilke should wander down. And I'd been researching him a bit. I'd seen some photos, and he did have have some fine hats that he wore in the countryside, and just that was, he appeared.
I've got this brilliant poster of him from his walks in Musée, and he's in a suit, completely pristine suit. And the photo goes from here down to his very beautiful shoes, and he's holding in these gorgeous hands, long, very white, a handbag. And it really is like a lady's handbag from the 50s, and so even walking for him was a performance.
An exercise in style.
Alone in Europe, German men always had purses.
Jo, can I just ask you a tiny question?
Yeah.
Did you like Rilke, after, through your contact with the poems and spending that time with him, did you end up liking him, do you think?
As a person,
Yeah.
Rilke the person, or Rilke, all the poems, or the...
I guess a bit of both, but maybe a bit of the person as well.
The poems only grew for me, and in fact doing this affected my response to the German language poems, in that they grew through doing this. The person,
Maybe it's not a fair
Extended love poem to him.
It's not a fair question, really.
You love him, but you don't like him.
That's it.
Well, how frequently does that
Yeah.
happen?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually,
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing for him to be a great poet, but for the man who left his daughter behind.
Yeah. But I just love the idea of the serendipity of, a project coming into being that one could never have planned, and that you could never have actually logically thought about it, but just finding a book in a bookshop, and then I love the way you described it, how it evolved over 10 years, you know. And even the publication history, as you say, had an element of serendipity to it as well. It's quite a magical story, really. So I think we'll stop there, and I would just like to thank Jo and Karen, first of all, for an absolutely wonderful hour. I think it was, you'll agree with me, it was very, very interesting. It just gave a wonderful insight, I think, into an encounter between two poets, first of all, and then between a poet and a translator. So thank you so much to both of you.